first of all, Professor Appel, thank you so much for taking the time, and agreeing to interview with us. We read your book with much enthusiasm, and we're hoping that this conversation will help other people, gain more insights into your brilliant work. And so we wanted to start with a quick warm-up question, since this class was organized around slow reading practice. We first wanted to ask you, how do you read? And maybe how do you read slowly in particular?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me here, and thanks for reading my book. I think if we're honest, it was probably Professor Ballestero who forced you to read my book, so thank you, Andrea. So yeah, I'm really happy to be here, and I'm always really happy to talk about reading, totally. I love to read. I think that that's probably one of the reasons that this job suits me in a way. Although when I first read your question, which was phrased in a like, what is reading to you? The first thing, so sadly, that popped into my head was, reading is something that I got to do in graduate school, and I'm really worried I'll never get to do again. Because, it's really kind of regimented into what you have to do in graduate school in a way that really stops when you become a faculty member, if that's the path that you end up on. And I've been a faculty member, I think, for about 5 years now, and I am still figuring out how to do slow and close reading as a faculty member. That said, in a kind of ideal world, for me, ideal reading is slow reading. That's really the kind of reading I love to do. And what that means to me is reading a book or an article from start to finish. I'm so sorry to the environment. I'm still like an old ass fuddy-duddy, but like on paper or in print. With a pen in my hand, and I do like a lot of underlining, and I do a lot of marginal notes. And then if it's an article or a book that I've either been like completely blown away by, or that's really closely related to, a project that I'm working on or something that I want to think through, I then transcribe my notes into a file. And I actually did that starting in graduate school, and it's just been an incredible resource for me, because then I can go back to not what would be kind of my interpretation or misinterpretation or whatever of some text that I read, but the way that I transcribe it, and I should have said this, is just like page by page, verbatim quotes from the text, and so some books, Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation or Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, I have like 15 pages of quotes, and some have like crazy stars next to them because I'm totally obsessed with them. So that to me is like part and parcel of the process of slow reading, is writing up those documents afterward. And again, those documents themselves, like the books, have this incredible shelf life. So I can go back to those documents when I'm remembering that I want to find that Robinson quote, and then I can find the page number, and then I can open the book to that page number and see what Robinson was talking about before or after. So that, I guess, is slow reading to me. And I guess the last thing I'll say related to how that has shifted since I've become a faculty member is this is the first year, again, it's probably like my 5th year teaching, that I've been brave enough to assign books to a class that I also haven't read. Keep in mind, I teach mostly undergrad, so I haven't yet actually ever taught a topical grad seminar like what you guys are doing. So it's the first time that I have been brave enough to just teach books that I want to read, but I don't know what's in them, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to teach them, but that I can read alongside the undergraduates. So we're reading Savannah Shangay's book right now. I did that with, I've been doing that with a bunch of stuff just this quarter, and it's really scary because you kind of lose some control as a professor, right? Because I don't know what I'm going to say about it before I read it, but it has now been a way to sort of structure slow reading into my life that's otherwise structured by teaching a lot. So that's new for me. That's like my courageous fall 2020 effort.
So maybe we should do like a very small disclaimer that our seminar is actually like mixed, both graduate and undergrad students.
Oh, cool.
Christina is undergrad, I think, so.
Yes, that's correct. So yeah.
So great.
So, okay, so maybe I can go to the second question. This question is related to the concept of unthinkable that we encountered reading Trio's book. And like the question is a longer one. Throughout our class, we have been discussing how to precipitate insight and or thoughts to one might not predict in the beginning of a research project. So what are your thoughts on ethnography as a way of thinking, and whether it allows us to approach the unexpected or unthinkable? And yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. So I'm going to answer it, I think, kind of in two parts. I'm going to talk first about this like ethnography and kind of anthropological projects, which I think is related to what Trio is saying about the Haitian Revolution, but I also think it's sort of slightly separate, or there are at least like two levels on which I want to think about it. So just in terms of like ethnography as a research methodology that leaves us open to the unexpected, or maybe even kind of guides us toward it or brings us toward it, you know, I think it certainly has that capacity. And ethnography is obviously a kind of big enough and amorphous enough description of research that different people do it entirely differently. I know certainly, you know, when I saw this question, I was kind of thinking back to my own work, and I was thumbing through the book a little bit to think about the kinds of unexpected things that I found in the field. And I think some of the stuff that was unexpected to me was really stuff that pushed against my own kind of ideological and political convictions. So for example, Equatorial Guinea, among many other, you know, nations on the African continent and elsewhere, went through really deep period of immiseration and austerity led by structural adjustment. And this was in kind of the late 1980s and early 1990s. And one of the, you know, so we know that like, so structural adjustment programs that come from the IMF or the World Bank, you know, you get loans. The sovereign government gets a series of loans, and in exchange for those loans, there are a series of conditionalities, right? So these are often things that the government is forced to do as a condition of being able to receive this money that they so desperately need. So one of the conditionalities on these loans in Equatorial Guinea and elsewhere, and I had learned about this long before I went to the field, right? I mean, I'm a student of Jim Ferguson and Akhil Gupta. This is like, you know, World Bank, IMF, structural adjustment, my whole, you know, graduate school life. Is the idea coming now from the World Bank and the IMF that like the democratization can somehow be a conditionality of a loan, right? That's laughable. I mean, when you get a PhD in anthropology or critical development studies, it's actually something that you would laugh at. The idea that some kind of democratic practice or like efflorescence of democracy, whatever that is, could come as a conditionality on a loan. I show up in Equatorial Guinea, and the opposition party, right? So it remains like a very paranoid, closed dictatorship. It's actually the longest serving leader in the world right now is the president of Equatorial Guinea. So I spent quite a bit of time with the opposition while I was there. And when the opposition talked about what those particular conditionalities on IMF World Bank loans enabled, which was just a very superficial legalization of opposition parties, which had been completely illegal in Equatorial Guinea before then, they talked about it as a time of nostalgia. Not that they liked the immiseration and austerity that came with the IMF programs, right? Not that, but that this kind of what, as an anthropologist, I had been trained and still frankly think is a totally fucking ridiculous idea that kind of like superficial level democratization could actually lead to deeper forms of participatory practice, right? That was true for opposition members in Equatorial Guinea. It's not that they think that sort of overly powerful kind of empires of transnational, you know, what do you call these things? Like international financial institutions are the way to find that. But in fact, the sort of superficial legalization of opposition political parties did lead to the first and only election, right, in which opposition parties gained a significant number of seats in parliament. It obviously didn't last. One cannot say that an externally imposed sort of empire of democracy project worked in Equatorial Guinea, obviously, nor were the opposition members saying that. But that was a real surprise to me. And I had to really take that seriously. And I write about it in the book. So there are other moments, I guess the only other, not the only other moment, but the only other moment I'll say about that here is, you know, when I'm writing, and I saw you guys were asking about some of it in your questions about the Orange summer stage, right? Which is, so Orange is like a brand of France Telecom, and they were trying to make inroads in the cell phone market in Equatorial Guinea. And one of the ways they did this is by like putting on a kind of arts-based summer festival in the main kind of alcalde, like the mayoral square in Equatorial Guinea, in Malabo, in the capital city. And so basically what it was is it was one of these, I mean, I think at least those of us who grew up in the US were very accustomed to seeing these like corporate sponsored public events. So there's like a big stage and there are orange signs everywhere. And then they gave sort of very small stipends to youthful acts, most of them hip hop acts, some of them dance acts, to come and like sing on stage. And then in between it was just like orange radio promotions, you know? But in Equatorial Guinea, nothing like this, at least up until that point, that wasn't something that happened. You know, like the Spanish Cultural Center or the French Cultural Center, these like international cultural centers would sometimes put on public performances. But because of the particular history of this country, the people who participated in them, they had like very specific alliances. And this, because it was a kind of relatively new opportunity, I mean, it was like crazy. People in Malabo would walk by and be like, oh, what's that? A lot of people didn't feel comfortable attending because it felt so subversive. And so it really was this thing that a kind of capitalist, sort of plainly, openly capitalist intervention had enabled something that, especially for the young musicians, many of whom I knew well and had worked with for a long time up until then, they were like, that was so awesome. Like, we actually got to sing that song about marijuana. And did you see the mayor walk out? Oh, that was crazy, right? Like, it was just, it had a kind of a felt, an embodied openness to it. And like, what's the word? Like, oh my God, anything could happen, that was much rarer in other parts of Equatorial Guinean public life or artistic life. Now, that said, and as I say in the book, Orange only has permission to do something like this because they are in sort of intimate and lucrative complicity with people, with higher ups in the government. So it doesn't actually have a kind of, to me, it's not at all a structural rupture. But I felt like, in terms of this question of like what can ethnography reveal that's sort of unexpected, it was this like really taking seriously the embodied feeling for those young musicians that they were able to perform a song here that they'd never been able to perform before in public, and that when they had recorded it, they had gone across the national border to Gabon because they couldn't record it in a recording studio in Equatorial Guinea. So again, this is not me making like an argument for the structural rupture of what Orange was able to do, but kind of being surprised by and kind of really forcing myself to take seriously the freedom that those people felt in that moment, and acknowledging that it was this very sort of it was a capitalist intervention that had enabled that for them. So that's kind of the first thing I'll say that to me is more narrowly about when I was in the field, how did kind of taking ethnography as a kind of immersive experience seriously open me up to things that I was surprised about. That's that. And Michel Rolf Trio, talking about the kind of unimaginable in the Haitian Revolution, I think is slightly different. And I actually think this is much more related to, obviously, when we think about the Haitian Revolution, what might be profound structural or revolutionary change, and not being able to see that in the moment, because in the moment, to bring it right into 2020, it looks like what some people call riots. And it looks like what other people call uprisings. And it looks disorganized. And it looks like, what the fuck are these people doing? And why aren't they just going out and voting, right? And it looks like violence. And it looks like smashing windows, right? I mean, think about being in the Haitian Revolution in the years that it is unfolding, right? So that, I think, is the kind of unexpectedness that Rolf Trio is getting at. And I actually think it's very useful to talk about in the fall of 2020, to say, and I feel willing to say it, that we are in a revolutionary moment. And what does it mean to fully dwell and step into that revolutionary moment and recognize it as that, even in a way that is aspirational, and be in it right? Move into it, step into it, name it as such, and step into it as such. So I think that's a slightly different question than the question of, you know, what does like an ethnographic, a commitment to ethnographic research open us to that we're not necessarily. Rolf Trio, I think, is like, you know, sometimes it's very hard to name moments as revolutionary when we are in them, because they are abolitionist moments. They're about abolishing the conditions under which we were made to understand what a political victory was, right? So abolition is the perfect theoretical framework in which, I think, in which to think what Trio is thinking, right? Because abolition is the abolition of the wins, the abolition of the campaigns, the abolition of the very structures in which we were taught, again, to kind of understand political progress or political wins. And so that, I think, is kind of what Trio is saying, like, we could see this in retrospect in the Haitian Revolution, and then by extension, where can we see it in our lives and kind of know it and trust it? And I do think that this is a moment but also very far beyond the United States, where that we have the ability to name something like that.
Thank you. That was inspiring.
Okay. Yay.
It made, like, one of the things that we briefly talked about in class was David Graeber's prompt to act as if we are free, and yeah, it made me think a lot about that too. I'm moving to the other question. So another topic we discussed in our class was the crisis and what kinds of questions crisis analysis typically foreclose. And as we read in your book, you address this theme and you argue for, and I'm quoting from you, an anthropology of capitalism that proceeds not from a sociology of error, but from the question of how what currently exists has been stabilized, end of quote. And your analysis takes capitalism not as a misrepresentation to, you know, deconstruct it, but as a, and I'm quoting it again from you, as a constant construction project that you engage with through your research. So taking this as a background, we were also wondering, how would you reflect on, you know, the relationship between truth, or truths in plural, and the licit, and how do you think licit as an analytic that you're using, relying on, push beyond both the impasse of ontological pluralism that Reutemann discusses in their book on in Anti-Crisis, and it also pushes beyond the logics of crisis as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a good question. If I do say so myself, in the presence of an undergrad, it's a very grad student-y question. Like, it's so heady. But this is what I would say. So I was writing, you know, we all, I think, end up writing in response to what we've been reading in graduate school, right? So we go into the field kind of with these tools, and even as an undergraduate, right? You go, if you're able to do an anthropological project, you're going into the field with a kind of corpus of work that you've been reading over your anthro major or your anthro PhD or whatever it is. So the corpus of work that I had been reading as somebody who was really interested in the anthropology of capitalism often focused on kind of ruptural moments in capitalist practice, right? The sort of like worst of the worst oil spill that had ever happened, or, you know, when an entire forest was cut down to do this, and all of the indigenous people were displaced, right? It was like, it always, I felt that it so often started from like, capitalism is this like profound, pointed evil. And if we just look at these moments of horror and rupture and dirty underwear, you know, then we can somehow convince everybody that to kind of go with us. And as I say in the book, you know, both US oil majors abroad and a kind of kleptocratic Central African country could go in that direction analytically, right? I mean, like, US oil majors are the single most polluting and the single sort of most profitable, as I say in the book, kind of angel of the Anthropocene on our planet, right? You can, and many people have told these sort of like horrifying stories of their daily practices around the world. And obviously, you know, anthropologists too, while we are also, and this is a generalization, but like very dedicated to understanding how, you know, different governmental practices or political sensibilities and ideologies work, there is still a tremendous amount of anthropology that focuses on like deep corruption and for like of African governments, right? So I could have gone that route, but what I saw on the ground working with these oil companies and in Equatorial Guinea was so much about like, how can we keep this transparent? How is this about market rationality, right? Like, well, what is the contract? What is the subcontract? You know, what is the extractive industries transparency program? Right? It was so much about creating what I ended up calling the licit life of capitalism, even amidst profound white supremacy and profound environmental degradation and profound dispossession of all kinds. And it was that, like those processes that allowed it to seem smooth and still allowed all of that oil to get to market. It's like, if it's so fucked up, then how the fuck does it work, right? Like, if it's really just so fucked up, shouldn't it just fail on its own? Well, surprise, it doesn't, right? So what is happening to allow it to keep going? And what is happening to allow, you know, the sort of white upper management and white owners to keep profiting, right? What is happening to allow the constant contravention of the sovereignty of African governments or governments around the world who end up signing on to these production sharing contracts? So that's what I ended up calling the licit life of capitalism. And so in a certain way, it does take our eyes off of, or ask us to take our eyes off of crisis and ask us to just watch the kind of daily reproduction of how this thing stays on the rails. So in that way, that's kind of its response to crisis. And I was just thinking about this question. I was looking in the afterword, because one of the people I use to talk about this is Cheryl Harris, who is actually a senior colleague of mine at UCLA. And she wrote this incredible article a while ago now called Whiteness as Property. But she writes about this in terms of whiteness, right? So it's, and again, I'm relating it to the present moment, but it's like, when we hear the phrase white supremacy, are we thinking about white nationalists coming armed with guns to Black Lives Matter rallies? And are we thinking about them marching with, you know, reminiscent of KKK rallies, marching with fire at a, you know, in West Virginia? Sure, and should we? Of course, that's a crisis of this moment, right? But to understand that as white supremacy is to completely overlook the systematicity and historical continuity in this country and elsewhere, but I'm just going to talk about the United States, of white supremacy as a kind of baseline of what we've come to expect. And this is all Cheryl Harris all day. So it's a 1993 article. It's called Whiteness as Property. So Cheryl Harris argues that whiteness as property retains its core characteristic, the legal legitimation, right? Not illegal, not controversy, not, oh my God, what are those crazy white people doing? The legal legitimation of expectations of power and control that enshrine the status quo as a neutral baseline. White supremacy is a neutral baseline while masking the maintenance of white privilege and domination. And to make that point, she goes way the fuck back to quote de Tocqueville, right? Democracy in America, where he says the United States has accomplished this twofold purpose of the extermination of the Indians and deprivation of rights legally, philanthropically, and without violating a single great principle of morality in the eyes of the world. De Tocqueville says, it is impossible to destroy men with more respect for the laws of humanity, right? I mean, and that, so this, I mean, this is like, not only is this Cheryl Harris, 1993, this is de Tocqueville in like whatever century he wrote that, right? So this is, it's a long lineage, I would say, of asking that we not get distracted by crisis. That was a long answer. And I'm going to add one more addendum, which is that, so Janet Reitman is a mentor of mine and has become a dear friend of mine. We're actually collaborating on a project right now. So I love you, Janet, no shade. But she and I actually really disagree on crisis and the role of crisis, right? So I've also written extensively about Occupy Wall Street. I actually think that moments of crisis, like the moment that we are in now, are incredibly important and incredibly productive, as long as we don't exceptionalize them, right? As long as we have the analysis that I just named, from de Tocqueville, from Cheryl Harris, from Janet Reutemann, from whoever it is, right, from Hannah Appel, as long as we understand the continuity of the conditions that we're looking at and don't believe like, oh, right now is a moment of crisis and we just need Joe Biden to get back in there and like rehire people in the Environmental Protection Agency and we'll be fine, right? That's crisis mentality that's fucked up and stupid, right? As long as we don't do that, I think that understanding moments of crisis as moments of really profound possibility is incredibly important politically. So, I was just we just did a big action on the UCLA campus on November 1st, because I think it was 4 months before that, UCLA in collusion with UCPD and LAPD had arrested a whole bunch of protesters all over the city in Black Lives Matter. Sorry, UCLA hadn't arrested them. LAPD had arrested them. A whole bunch of protesters all over the city, both from downtown, but some people at a protest in Westwood. Then they bused them to Jackie Robinson Stadium, which is where the UCLA baseball team plays. It's also on the Veterans Affairs property, the VA hospital property. UCLA administration knew about this and they held prisoners in buses for 7 to 8 hours it became a field jail, right? And yet you walk around the UCLA campus and like equity, diversity, and inclusion, Black Lives Matter, So we just held an event, kind of a Day of the Dead, a Dia de los Muertos event on November 1st, commemorating the Jackie Robinson Stadium becoming a field jail. And Melina Abdullah, who's one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter LA, Black Lives Matter nationally, was there. And she was talking and she was like, the world is split wide open right now. What does it mean, again, to step in, right? To recognize, as Trio would ask us to recognize when the world is split wide open. And even though we don't have the retrospective sense making of it, it is a revolution. This is the Haitian Revolution. This is the beginning of the end of US empire. This is the beginning of the end of white supremacy. To step into it as such and to recognize that crisis is a moment when, if the world has split open, that what I want to do, I'll speak for myself, but I know it's true of others too, is like to keep it open and to push it further and to push it further and not be fucking afraid and be like, oh, good, Joe Biden. Right? I mean, fine, Joe Biden better than the other version, but that's not the solution to our problems. That's the problematic crisis thinking that gets us to do conservative stuff. But I do think, again, as long as we understand the continuity of the form and don't believe in crisis that way, that asks us to revert to conservatism, then we can and must lean into crisis and understand it as a moment of profound possibility.
And on this note of profound possibility, I think it's kind of a good segue into the last question. And it's kind of two parts, but we're really interested in activism and social change and kind of where do we go from here? So the first question is about how you think the ambiguity of the location of offshore sites. So I guess like literally the physical location in this case, even though I know your book talks about it as kind of this like figurative, metaphorical sense too, how that plays into the formation of transnational environmental activism. And then second, in relation to this larger theme of activism and social change, having the case of, I think it's pronounced the Orange Festival and EITI in mind, and considering that, quote, to take the economy seriously is, in part, to take seriously people's fantasies about it, end quote. Can you imagine capitalism and its licitness being performed in the ways that can empower Equatorial Guineans in any foreseeable future?
No. No, I can't. No. And I'm sorry, I know that's like a really harsh answer, but as I said a little bit of this in a previous question, I think there are undeniable kind of embodied openings for Equatorial Guineans at different levels of like class position, relationship to the government, migration histories in their own lives. There are different ways that US oil coming to town, it really did sort of change the landscape profoundly, right? So I talked to you about those kids who were able to perform their song on the stage. And it was also, because just quite literally, as I write about in the book, these companies bring hundreds of thousands of foreign workers with them when they show up. Equatorial Guinea is a very small place, and previously movement had been pretty closely controlled. you can't really control a lot of movement anymore if literally like hundreds of thousands of people are cycling in and out of your airports all the time, right? So that kind of trickles out to Equatorial Guinean populations who enjoy, you know, kind of like slightly more freedom of movement or slightly less feeling of like really dramatic political repression. So my friend and colleague, upcoming anthropologist Adelaida Caballero, she talks about this during her time in Equatorial Guinea, which was after my time, as people saying that the dictadura is changing into a dicta blanda, right? So like a dictadura is like a dura is hard, so like a hard dictatorship, kind of morphed in an interesting way with the coming of the oil companies, at least on a quotidian basis, into a dicta blanda. But exactly as I said in that previous answer, that is only because the profits from the production sharing contract so profoundly strengthened the hand of Obiang's regime, right? That essentially now it is based on the fiscal and geopolitical strengths of US oil empire that he remains the longest serving dictator on the planet. It is literally only because of US oil. So yes, on the one hand, can you say dictadura became dicta blanda? Yes, but you can also say that dicta blanda is now like so far from anything, you know, like so far from anything resembling, I don't know, some kind of political or economic democracy. Now, that said, and I talk about this a little bit at the end of this book, you know, my post-grad school journey, both my pre-grad school journey and grad school was kind of a sojourn in a different place, but then my post-grad school journey has returned me very forcefully to anti-capitalist organizing, which is what I spend a lot of my time doing. And, you know, this book, I've done most of it like after I wrote this book and after I did the research for this book. In part, it's just circumstantial because Occupy Wall Street started while I was in a postdoc in New York. And so I was kind of like right there for it. And I had just gotten a PhD in the Anthropology of Capitalism. And I had this kind of fantasy that by having had the chance to slow read Marx, which I had, that I somehow knew what revolution meant or what it looked like. That is not true. That is a fantasy. It's not that liberal, funny, that's interesting that I said that. It's not that radical theory doesn't help. It's not that critical theory doesn't help. But when we are faced with collective action, with needing to build power across horrific lines of difference, critical theory is one tool that's incredibly important. But the idea that critical theory itself contains a kind of self-actualizing radical change, which I think, it's not that my teachers intentionally taught me that in grad school, but that it kind of had like sunk into me that that was the case. I wasn't doing shit. And it's not that I love grad school and I love being an anthropologist. This isn't to diss it, but it is to say it is so different from trying to build collective power and fucking, you know, bash white supremacy, bash patriarchy, bash capitalism. It is so different. And insofar as it gives us the fantasy that we're doing that when we're slow reading Marx, it is also, you know, like self-reproductive. It is conservative, right? In that it's like, oh well, yeah, I'm politically engaged. I read Marx today. It's like, yeah. So I think, and I write about this in the afterword, but I think it is so important to kind of bring these theories and bring these convictions beyond the page and see what happens to them beyond the page, because they get so profoundly challenged, or they get so, you know, you have to compromise in ways that you don't have to compromise when you write a book like this, right? We can write the most radical books, right? And then it's like, okay, we'll take it into the streets and see what happens. So yeah, I don't think that kind of interstitial spaces in capitalism is what's going to like be rad for Equatorial Guinea or other, you know, states whose sovereignty has been completely contravened by American imperialism. Nor do I want to discount what people have been able to experience in that time, right? Fine. But I also think a lot of that is somewhat separate, at least in my own life, from what you know, building power means.
Thank you. And you have a beautiful sentence about this. And if I may, I want to read that as a concluding remark. In the afterword, you say, if anthropological knowing has been a mode of power, then we must know more about that which we need more power over. So, and then you go on to compare this mode of knowing to the actual work that these theories might do out in the real world. And on that note, I guess we will conclude our interview. And once again, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. And we all read your book with much enthusiasm. I cannot wait to talk more to you. And yeah, thanks
so much. It was great to be here. Thank you for reading my book and inviting me to do this. It was really fun. Tell all my friends at Rice I said hi. It's such a great school. Okay. Thanks, everybody.